Chapter 17. Shadows on the Roofscape. Val. I knelt on the edge of the rooftop, searching the uneven lights as Etta raised her nose to the sky, reassessing directions against the many scents of the old city. I was impressed that she and Rowan had even been able to pick up the trail, showing a knack for investigation that would have impressed their father at his peak. It had been slow going to the temple spire we now settled along, a steady movement of 2 steps forward followed by 3 steps back and around. To remain hidden among the shifting torchlight and worm-winding alleys and haphazard structures of the old city required constant attention, especially with as many X's as lived here. There had always been techniques to avoid detection by those otherworldly senses, to try to reduce the trace that you left on the world and whichever one they lived in. But trying to teach them to Etta and Rowan on the fly just wasn't possible, and I would have no idea if it worked until it was too late. Instead, I just hoped that whatever instinct and training they had gotten from Darkstar had left them with some understanding. As a backup, I signaled to Rowan to notify me of all movements within his scent radius, hoping to at least keep us away from the other 5 senses all the X's still had. And somehow we managed, and we moved. Between the 3 of us, we plotted a course among the rooftops. We snuck through the back alleys, hidden in shadows, up onto ledges that wound down the hills, and into stair-stepped neighborhoods that laid out like the pieces of a maze dropped onto the slope. We glided through backyards, past windows hewn from fallen trees and heavy shifted stone, always keeping narrowly out of range of families and friends and gangs, all as we moved on towards that point out in the darkness where Rat waited for us. It wasn't long before the stair-stepped neighborhoods grew more crowded, more compact, with thin wooden roofs that creaked under our feet and slowed our progress even more. From the shadows, I saw drugged-out banksters collapsed across the street, and drunk fighting between women and husbands and sons and daughters. What I watched most for were the flickering sparks in the darkness where joints and spliffs and pipes burned, nearly invisible to my eyes thanks to the constant flush of bright lights. Those were the ones that might see us, but luckily they all had other things on their mind. I wasn't familiar with old city customs, but I did recognize some of the symbols built onto the doors of temples and buildings and structures that were constructed into groves in the trees, gaps in the hills. As we walked, we found many of the same, each with their own little congregation. The free people were deeply spiritual, and with the chaos of the evening before, I could understand the desire to turn to a higher power. To me, though, they were a minefield to navigate, and I guided Etta in wide circles around. But as sure as the night had grown dark, when Etta finally stopped and sat down, it was in an abandoned square of dirt out front of one of the small houses, with nose pointed firmly at the lights of a temple. I strode up through the dusty yard to crouch beside her again, instructing Rowan to do a single final sweep as I knelt down next to Etta, rubbing her behind the ears. "Nika, good girl," I said, ruffling her fur. Her ears twitched at the congratulatory word, our backup for when I didn't have a treat for them, and with confidence she pawed the ground once more. Rat was inside, which complicated things. Had this been a hit, a simple execution through the skylight during the service or as he stepped out onto the streets, it would have been much simpler. But I needed him alive. For the moment, he was my only lead on the Machine King, so we would have to wait and track him as he came out. I scanned the rooftops looking for a better position, eventually leading the hounds back up the hill and across a dark ridge about a dozen yards above us. There we clung to the shadows and cover, provided by clothes strung out between tall trees and ancient huts. I squinted, peering in through the massive skylight. On the inside, the freemen sat in packed pews in rows, listening to what looked like a group of speakers. One, an older woman with shaved head and long robes, was passionately gesturing as she spoke, earning nods and raised fists of those who sat among the pews. Adjusting my position, I moved left and right behind the brush, searching for some way to spot Rat, but my limited vision was all that I could draw from, and I had none of the equipment I might have used for a more in-depth stakeout. As they came out, he would have about a quarter's chance of going in each direction along the streets, each bringing up their own issues, especially the longer he waited before departing. It had been hard enough to get down here with the streets empty, and as the crowd left service onto the streets, it was only going to bring more and more and more people, and then the situation might turn ugly. An improvised weapon might bring me some success if I tried to retreat, but I had no evac, no backup, and the other side of the river only brought me more trouble. It reminded me of Jakur, and I hadn't thought about Jakur in ages. A cool breeze brought a shudder through my whole body, and I settled down into a crouch again, signaling Etta and Rowan further up the slope. We would sacrifice visual contact, but staying down there would be a needless risk, especially with the freemen now standing together in the beginnings of a grand song, one that I could hear echoing out from other temples across the city. We had to go now. I almost missed the scratching of Etta's paws on the ground. She'd spotted something. With the crowd still singing, Etta was back on the trail, tracing the stalking figure of Rat out the front door and down the road, heading further towards the sea. I saw him, that greased-back hair, that hunched-over walk. It was him, all right. "Nika, Eda," I grunted, ruffling the hound's fur. "Nika. Eda, Rowan, Mazd." With my second signal, I told them that I would take charge here, and I made sure that both of them were now signaling for any intruders, following Rowan's instructions. Then we set off, looping high up into the hills, tracking Rat's progress down the roads through town, going even further from the river and into the heart of the old city. Rat stayed in the center of the roads, far too visible for us to take him out, and he tracked the rooftops and alleys as he went, on the lookout for us or anyone else that might be following him. He had talked about a long, successful career beyond the law, and he showed it with his caution. I was caught between two minds as we tracked him, whether to strike now and waste no more time, or leave the man be and let him lead us. But his course through the busy roads and streets left me no choice but to follow from the shadows. I could see Etta and Rowan triggering at the voices that called out, at the sounds of the churches and services with voices lifted in song. To their hyper-aware senses, it must have been a flood as they tried to pick out any individual scents and sounds that stood apart as coming towards us, but throughout it they stood strong, signaling and unwavering in their tasks. Darkstar would never have forgiven me for taking his children so lightly. I couldn't spend my entire time checking back on them, and I just had to trust that they would deliver, and step up when the time was right. And so we followed, me still tracking Rat, them still tracking any potential threat, and with the river far behind us, Rat finally turned again, down a smaller road against the hills, where the homes broke the tops of the topography, in elegantly worked stone and wood villas that were outlined by manicured green spaces and smooth stone streets. Looping far around, we diverged, circling south deeper into the old city, where a grove of trees lined the hillside, marking a boundary between elegant homes and more of those small clustered houses carved from wood and dirt. We moved, but then the hounds began to signal for the arrival of countless potential threats. The songs had been sung, the services were over, and now the people of the old city returned to their homes, making their way back to the neighborhoods beneath us. We held the course, though, weaving along the line between elegance and squalor as the people of the town slowly filtered in. Now we dodged wells and wooden toys, Kraska balls abandoned over fences, clotheslines hidden in the trees, but for all that we danced closer and closer along the edge of the stair streets, the hound sounded no alarm. We were keeping ahead of the steady stream of people, and as the ridge curved again, reaching its end, I signaled to the hounds to stop. Rat had reached his destination. We had some elevation, and I scanned the estates as Rat made his way to the door of one of the grand homes. It was a multi-tiered place with a pair of balconies and a garden, but it may as well have been a shack compared to the homes of soaring columns and towers and windows that made up the center of the town. A spyglass would have been helpful, again, but watching the gaps in the windows, I caught the flicker of candles, the movement of shadowy figures against the silent but well-lit blinds. The only people outside were a pair of lookouts posted in the shadows of the second-floor balcony, but they went inside just as soon as Rat did. They all fit Rat's demeanor far more than the Holmes, dressed in dirty clothes and looking entirely out of place. At a signal, both of the hounds turned towards the home, then tapped and gave me the signal for a den. That was the limit of the information that they could give me, at least for now. Ed and Rowan, for all their talent, couldn't turn a smell into a three-dimensional location, and even if they could have, it wouldn't be possible to transfer that information to me effectively. I had tried to come up with a system with Darkstar, but that just wasn't how scent trails worked. Ed and Rowan both sat, awaiting my command, but from here on I had to go alone. They'd done better than I could have hoped to get me this far, but infiltration, especially into a home like that, required a different touch. The freemen were still returning to the stair streets behind me, and while it didn't seem like anyone seemed interested in crossing the ridge into the nicer part of town, I didn't want to take any chances. With a deep breath, I signaled to both of them through a complicated series of commands. They were to stay hidden and alert, but also track me, listening for my signal if needed. Then, if there were any threats to them, they were to run. They were unblinking and attentive, and when I asked them for the first time in a long time for confirmation, each tapped a front paw that they understood. I left them then, using the cover of shadows to weave down the hill towards the estates.